Jesus was a storyteller, really an incredible storyteller at that. 1/3 of all of Jesus' words recorded in the New Testament are in the form of stories or parables. 1/3 of everything that he said in the New Testament was contained in the parables. There are more than 40 parables that we find in the Gospels. Our time is short this morning, so I'm going to just jump right on in as we begin a new series, a short little series here, examining a few of the parables. What I find when we come to the parables, when we read the parables, when we study the parables ourselves, or even when we preach on the parables, oftentimes we approach them incorrectly. A lot of times we read the parables and we go away scratching our head just a little bit because we're not exactly sure what in the world Jesus was trying to say, and that was very different than what the people who originally heard those parables. Almost always, the people didn't go away scratching their head wondering what he said. They went away nodding, shaking their heads, really amazed at what he said, or even disagreeing with what he said. Most of Jesus' parables, they were shocking to the first listeners. For many of us, over the 2,000 years history between Jesus and us, the shock and the horror of what he said has been lost on us. So I want to give you a couple. So in the message today, I'm going to give you a couple of pieces of advice when you approach the parables. And so if you even want to take notes, there aren't many times that I say you might want to take notes on this. This is one that you may want to take a couple of notes on this, because I think oftentimes we get the parables wrong. And we push the parables to say something that Jesus never intended to say. So a couple of pieces of advice as we get started this morning. First, as we think about how to study the parables, first we need to pay attention to who Jesus is speaking to. Who is Jesus speaking to? Sometimes Jesus is speaking to only his disciples, meaning those who are faithfully committed. Other times, Jesus is speaking to the crowds, and included in the crowds are those who aren't yet believers. They aren't God-fearers. They are not believers in any sense of the word. And then there are other times that the gospel writer will give us a heads up about what the parable is going to be about. For example, in today's parable, Luke introduces the parable by saying this: he also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. It's pretty clear on what this parable is going to be about. Jesus here is speaking to those who are prideful. He is telling a parable about pride. So we need to pay attention to who Jesus is speaking to. Also, we need to pay attention to what is repeated. Sometimes in parables, especially some of the longer parables, there will be phrases or there will be words that are repeated. Pay attention to those words that are repeated. Sometimes there's almost a mantra type of effect that Jesus is telling this story, and time again, he repeats a word or a phrase. You need to pay attention to that word or a phrase oftentimes that is significant. Also, you may need to take note of the beginning and the end of the parable, especially in the longer parables, the parable of the prodigal son. You need to pay attention to the beginning and the end. Now, all of it's important, but especially pay attention to the beginning and the end. You also need to note the surprise or the twist. Oftentimes there's a twist in the plot of these stories that Jesus tells. And here's where we oftentimes get into trouble. We come to parables with we've often heard them so many times. Our parable, even today, we've heard this parable so many times that we come to the parable and we have some preconceived ideas, and we miss kind of the surprise at the end. Well, the first listeners, this parable that Jesus told would have been shocking to them. They would not have gone away scratching their head a little bit. They would have gone away nodding their heads and thinking to themselves, Jesus got this wrong. But for many of us, 2,000 years later, that surprise is missed on us. And so this is where we need to do a little bit of historical context study of the historical context, because parables were told to teach one point. That's what they were told to teach. They were told to teach one point. And oftentimes, so that's a final note that I would say, look for the one point. What is the one point that this parable is trying to teach us about? Oftentimes, there are people who look at parables as if they are allegories, or if they are metaphors, or if they are similes. And sometimes there are metaphors and similes used, but parables are not allegories. Hear me now. Parables are not allegories. Jesus is not trying to teach us with coded language here. What's lost on us is typically the 2,000 years history between Jesus telling them and our reading them. But people will get into trouble sometimes when we try to turn parables into allegories, as if, well, this obviously stands for this, and this actually means that, or this means that. Very seldom are there hidden meanings in the parable. Some of them, I'll be honest, I continue to scratch my head over one or two of them, not exactly sure what to do with them, but you can be assured that the first listeners wouldn't have necessarily been so confused. Oftentimes we can't, I think that we can never push a parable too far. And I find people doing this all the time, especially Jesus' parables about the kingdom, or about the kingdom of heaven, especially his parables about heaven and hell. I find people pushing those parables too far, places that Jesus never intended them to go. Again, Jesus oftentimes in those parables is not trying to teach us about heaven or hell. He's teaching us about one point that we need to pay very careful attention to. So with those kinds of things in mind, let's approach our parable here in our scripture this morning. So again, Luke introduces this parable by simply saying, he told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. So again, we already have an understanding here that this is a parable about pride. People who think more highly of themselves, people who think of themselves as righteous and holy and better. Well, Jesus has some words to say about that. And so he begins. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Here from the very beginning, this is where we have to strip ourselves of our preconceived ideas about what this parable is about. Because 2,000 years later, and likely you have heard sermons on this parable, likely you have read about this parable, and you know something about the Pharisees. And so immediately coming into this parable, you hear the word Pharisee and you think, ooh, he's the bad guy. He's the bad one here in this parable. And you hear about a tax collector and you think, oh, he's the good one. But that is the exact opposite of what the first listeners would have thought. Because the Pharisee was a rule follower. Beyond anything else, the Pharisee was a rule follower. The Pharisees were the good guys. Always. They were the good guys. They did what was right. Always. They never strayed from what was right. They would have been the best church members. They would have been the best neighbors on the block. They would not have played their music past 10 p.m. They would have kept their yard mowed all the time. They would have followed the rules. This was a person that you would love to be sitting next to in church, the Pharisee. They were the good guys. The tax collectors, however, they were not the good guys. There was no good in the tax collector at all. The tax collectors were the woes, and in the ancient Near East, or at least in Judea, the tax collectors were Jews. They were Jews, and they were working on behalf of the Roman government, the Roman Empire. The Romans were the foreign oppressors who had come in, and they were ruling with an iron fist in Israel. And so the Roman Empire needed taxes collected, and so they would always recruit someone who was a local, someone of that area, someone of the same ethnicity and religion of their neighbors, and they would pay them to collect the taxes on behalf of the Roman Empire. And so the way it worked was that the emperor or the Roman officials would tell the tax collector how much they needed to pay the Roman government. And so that's what would happen every year. However, two things to note. One, the tax collector carried with them the authority of the Roman Empire. And so if a tax collector said that you owed $500, there was no second opinion, you owed $500. It didn't matter. You had no recourse whatsoever. And if the tax collector said that you owed $500, you wrote the check, whether you had the money or not, or you were going to go to prison, or maybe even be put to death. And so the tax collector carried with them the authority of the Roman Empire. Also, the empire didn't care how much money the tax collector actually collected. They cared about how much money the tax collector turned in. And so it was very common. It was very common for the tax collector to collect at least twice the amount that they actually turned in to the Roman Empire. The rest of it they would pocket. And so it may be that the Roman Empire said they needed to collect, they needed $10,000 from that tax collector. Well, the tax collector would go out and collect $20,000. Give 10 of it to the Roman Empire and pocket the other 10. And this was a fellow Jew that was doing all of this. And so the tax collectors were despised. They were hated. Even more so than, I don't know, something like an A&M graduate going to work for the University of Texas. I mean, it was even worse. I heard those groans back there. It was even worse than that. Even worse than that, if you can imagine something even worse. The tax collectors were hated. They were hated by everyone. And so already in the story, the first listeners, they would have been thinking, okay, this Pharisee, he is a good and righteous man. And this tax collector is a sinner and forgotten by God. In fact, even cursed by God. So they went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other tax collector. And the Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus. Now let me note it here. Why in the world would a Pharisee be standing by himself in the middle of the temple? That would have been difficult to do, by the way, because the temple would have been filled at all times. People praying and people confessing and people receiving forgiveness of sins. And so the Pharisee was standing by himself because according to the Pharisaic law, they had to be completely ritually and religiously clean. And they could not have any contact with any sinner. So the Pharisee was there by himself. He was standing by himself. Other translations really have maybe a better translation. They say the Pharisee was standing with himself, within himself. He found righteousness within himself and only within himself. And he prayed thus. God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, the unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. Here's the crazy thing about this prayer. He was exactly right. He was unlike any of the rest of them. And he thanked God that he wasn't like the rest of them. He thanked God that he wasn't like the rest of them. I fast twice a week, he said. Pharisees were only required to fast once a week, every Thursday. The Pharisees fasted. He was not just a Pharisee, he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was a super good guy. He was super religious. Practicing fasting not just one day a week, but 2 days a week. Tithing, not just, our translation today says, all that I get. Other translations, or maybe a better translation, it says, I give tithes of all that I have. He is going above and beyond the service. He is a super follower of God. But then, the tax collector, standing far off in a corner, because he didn't want to come close to the Holy of Holies. He did not feel worthy to come into the presence of God. Standing far off, would not even lift his eyes toward heaven, but beat his breast in mourning, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, Jesus continued, this man, here's the twist, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. That's the twist. Because in the people's minds, it would have been the Pharisee who was justified. Everything he said was right. He was better than everyone else. But it was the tax collector who went away justified. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Pride is the sin that is most common among all people. The Desert Fathers understood that. In fact, they were the first ones to say it. You may have heard the 7 deadly sins. The 7 deadly sins. The first of the 7 deadly sins, and that list of the 7 deadly sins comes from the early church fathers, and especially the Desert Fathers. So what the Desert Fathers did, they were living in cities, and they were living in the culture, and they realized that there was sin in their life, and so they thought to themselves, it's the culture that is sinful, and so I'm going to remove myself from culture, and I'm going to seclude myself literally out in the wilderness, out in the desert. And so that's what they did. And there were some things that they were able to leave behind, living lives of solitude. They were able to leave behind gossip. They didn't have anybody to gossip with. But the one sin that they found that followed them more than any other, and the one sin that they could not escape from in and of themselves, was the sin of pride. It's the most common sin of all people, thinking that we are better than other people, relying upon our own goodness. You see, pride is antithetical. It is the antithesis to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Pride tells us that we are good enough, and we are holy enough to be loved by God, and we can earn our way into heaven. And the gospel of Jesus Christ tells us that we can never be good enough. No matter how good you are, you can never be good enough to earn God's love. This is only by God's mercy. The Pharisee didn't realize it, but the tax collector did. That's what separated them. The Pharisee believed that he could justify himself, that he could be good enough to earn God's love by himself, but the tax collector recognized that he was a sinner. Have mercy upon me, God, I am a sinner. Our pride, hear this, our pride can cancel out our virtues, but humility can overcome many sins in the sight of God. I'm going to say that again. Our pride can cancel out our virtues and our goodness and our righteousness, but humility can overcome many a sin in the sight of God. We are called to be humble, recognizing that no matter who we are, no matter what we have done, we all stand in need of a Savior. And that Savior is Jesus Christ.